My castaway this week is a politician whose liberal background and right to a title has not prevented him from becoming one of this country's most eloquent socialists. As a young MP, he renounced his peerage and went on to become a member of every Labour government of the 60s and 70s. In the years of opposition which have followed, he has allied himself to the left of his party and ruffled the feathers of its leaders by mocking their opinions and vying with them for office. At the age of 63, he continues to be an active backbencher, without power perhaps, but still with influence, an influence which his critics say only contributes to Labour's failure to be elected again. He is, of course, Tony Benn. Mr. Benn, you are both loathed and loved, with probably few people falling in between the two. How does that affect you, never quite knowing what sentiment you're going to bump into next?
Well, I'm not aware, you see, of being loathed except by people with power. Certainly going round in the street and shopping and on my bike in Chesterfield and on the bus and the train, people are tremendously warm.
You're never abused?
I think somebody once waved an umbrella and said rubbish at me, which is the most violent word used in political controversy among the populace.
Would you admit, like any politician or any performer, to having a weakness for adoring audiences?
No, but I mean, if you open the newspapers for years and find your view attacked and distorted and misrepresented, and then you go to meetings and people respond, it's that keeps you going, really.
Well, we shall talk more of that later, but first of all I want to know how you regard going to the desert island. After all, there are no audiences, there's no support, there's no one.
I suppose it would be an opportunity to reflect, and I hope I'd had pen and paper to write and think. But I am a gregarious soul, a family person, and I like being with other people, so I suppose I would miss it a great deal, miss the community a great deal. But it might be like going into a retreat, as long as it didn't last forever and ever and ever.
Are you a religious man?
Well, you see, I suppose the most powerful influence in my life is what would be called the dissenting tradition. An ancestor of mine, William Benn, the Reverend William Benn in Dorchester, was ejected from his living in 1662 because he wouldn't take instructions and was a Congregationalist. My father's father, was a Congregational minister in East London, the Reverend Julius Benn, who worked in the cholera outbreak. My mother, who is still alive at 92, was the first president of the Congregational Federation. I must be the only man in public life, or indeed anywhere else, whose mother was the head of a Christian denomination. And this passion for justice is one that goes back to the beginning of history and will never be extinguished. And I think that is the most powerful influence. Why do we live in an unjust world and an unjust society when we are all equal in the eyes of God?
Shall we pause there then and have your first record, because I think it's quite apt at this moment, isn't it?
Yes, I would like He Who Would Valiant Be, Bunyan's hymn. I think that probably would be the most inspiring piece of music to remind me of the traditions to which I've just referred.
He Who Would Valiant Be, sung by the Worcester Cathedral Choir. Mr. Benn, obviously you have a strong sense of family and a family history. What people always remember about you, of course, is that you renounced the title that you inherited from your father, Viscount Stansgate. How did he come by it?
My dad was elected in 1906 as a Liberal member. He's a radical Liberal. He was a junior whip before the First World War, and then in the 20s he resigned from the Liberal Party and joined the Labour Party. He was then elected as a Labour member, was Secretary of State for India in the 29-31 government, was defeated in 31, got in again in 37, and then during the war in 1940 he rejoined the services. He joined the Air Force at the age of 63, my age, because he felt he wanted to fight against fascism and so on. And then Churchill said to Attlee, we'd like a few Labour peers. And so father agreed to become a peer. Now, my older brother Michael was going into the church. He was a lovely person, and he wouldn't have been affected by it in any way. And so my father took it, and there were no life peers then. So when my brother Michael was killed in 1944 as a pilot in the RAF, I was saddled with the thing, and my dad was very sad about it and guilty, or quite wrongly so. And so when I was elected to Parliament in 1950, I knew my Commons life was limited by his life. He was then 73. He lived for 10 years. When he died, they threw me out of the Commons. They had a by-election in my constituency, and I was re-elected as a disqualified candidate. I turned up in the House of Commons. They threw me out again. They took me to court. They threw me out again. They put the man I defeated in Parliament. There was such an outcry. They changed the law. But it was a very interesting exercise in how the British Constitution works. But I don't come from a long line of aristocrats, as they make out. I mean, I come from a socialist family, and Father happened, like many people, at the end of his life, to be made a peer.
But he was guilty, you say, about having lumbered you with this title?
Yes, he was very worried, quite wrongly so, really, and he helped me no end, and he...
you discussed what you should do?
Oh, we planned every bit of it, and in 1955, before he died, I introduced a bill in the Commons, and he in the Lords, and Churchill gave a lot of support, wrote me a letter, which I circulated in the by-election I've referred to. But it taught me something about the British Constitution, that you never win at the top. You only win when you take the argument out to the public.
Let's have another record.
Yes, A Sheep May Safely Graze. It was played at my brother Michael's funeral when he was killed during the war. Caroline, my wife, who is very musical, chose it for our wedding in Cincinnati in 1949. It's sung by Kirsten Flagstad, and it's the most lovely piece of music, very quiet and peaceful, and I think... would be a great comfort if I was on your desert island.
Bach's Sheep May Safely Graze, sung by Kirsten Flagstad with the London Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Sir Adrian Boult. Mr. Benn, let's just go back to your beginnings for a few minutes. Where were you born?
I was born in London, next to the Tate Gallery, 40 Grosvenor Road. I lived there until after I was married, when I moved to a flat in Hammersmith. So that was really my base, and that's where all my childhood memories come from.
I've heard you say before now that you spent all your life on the 88 bus route. What does that mean?
The 88 goes next to the Tate Gallery, and when I married, I moved with Caroline to Stamford Court in Goldhawk Road, which the 88 passes, and then we moved to Notting Hill Gate, which the 88 bus passes. And the 88 bus, of course, goes to the House of Commons. So if ever I write my autobiography, I think I shall call it 88. Because that bus has flown. You remember Lady Eden said the Suez Canal flowed through her living room. The 88 bus has flowed through my life.
Now, you said that yours was an intensely political family, a liberal family, and then your father became a member of the Labour Party. But what were they like as a family, as people? Were you well-to-do for a start?
I was brought up in what you would call a comfortable middle-class background. I had a very close family. My father was 20 years older than my mother, a tremendous family man. My mother very devoted. I had an elder brother, Michael, to whom I was absolutely devoted, and a younger brother, David. It was a very close family, always very close. And in the evenings, we used to have musical evenings, rather a Victorian habit. And I used to wind up the old gramophone and play records. And that has persisted and continued with my own family, and my wife, Caroline, a very close relationship with her family. And it has been a very supportive thing through all the trials and tribulations of life. To have a family seems to me to be very helpful.
And your mother is 92
92.
And still living.
Oh, yes, yes.
What does she think of everything that's happened to you? What does she say to you? Does she feel pleased, or does she feel disappointed by the way your career has gone?
Oh, I think she's, well, first of all, don't relate her only to me. I mean, she's a person very much in her own right.
Is she never critical of you when you go to see her? Does she say, oh, Tony, or does she call you Tony?
No, she calls me James, because my father could never remember my name, so he used to call me James and Alexander and various other things. And the James is the one that stuck. That's a new media myth you'll have to pursue now, but she always calls me James.
Does she never say, look, James, what have you been up to now?
Oh, she's very supportive, but I mean, we have discussions, and you mustn't think that family discussions are, political in a narrow sense. It's a continual mutual influence.
No, certainly. However, she happens to be the mother of a son who was at one point talked about as a possible Prime Minister, and that is not in the end what he became, and therefore there must be a sense of...
How do you know? No, I think the point really is this. There are two types of political life. There is the search for status and the search for influence. And I did decide, I suppose, quite consciously, that just climbing up the slippery pole in the hope of getting somewhere was not really a satisfying existence. I've had all the fruits of office, but I have tried to use such experience as I have to encourage other people. And if I had an epitaph, I would like people to say, he encouraged us.
Your third record, please.
My third record is Michael Flanders and Donald Swann. Now, Michael and Donald and I were at school together, and this is Slow Train. And I think for a lot of people who have that same nostalgic love of steam, and I say this as an old Minister of Technology, Slow Train has got all the nostalgia, all the memories, and, of course, this marvellous singing by Michael Flanders and the playing by Donald Swann. So, Slow Train.
Millersdale for Tideswell, Kirby Muxlow, Malcop and Scholar Green. No more will I go to Blandford Forum and Morty Ho. On the slow train from Midsummer Norton and Mumby Road.
Michael Flanders and Donald Swann singing Slow Train. So, Tony Benn, you went up to Oxford, you became president of the Union, the war intervened. You were in the Navy, weren't you?
Well, I was in the RAF first, and I got my wings and became a pilot in the RAF in 1945, and then the war ended. My war career was not one of any distinction, but I did serve for a number of years, and then I went back to college.
Now, at which point then did you meet your wife?
Well, she came over on a summer school from Vassar, and we met on August the 2nd, 1948. And somebody had told me she was there and said, you'd like to meet a man called George Harris. So I went and had tea with her, and then, being a shy person, took me 9 days to propose, and I proposed on a bench in Oxford. And I bought the bench for £10 later. And
did you?
It
Where is
stands in
it?
our front garden. We sat there, and the clock at St Philip and St James had just struck midnight. And I proposed to her, and then she went home and did her postgraduate degree. And then I went over in 49 and we were married, so we've got the 40th Ruby wedding this summer. And she has been, I think, the principal, without any question, the principal influence on the major questions. So we've had a very happy partnership.
Have you gone on being desperately romantic throughout it?
Well, I am a much more sentimental person. When I sit and watch The Railway Children, which is one of my favourite programmes with my daughter, Melissa, she turns and sees the tears rolling down my cheeks when Daddy appears after the cloud of steam and so on. I think a capacity to cry is a very necessary part of humanity. People are different, but I happen to be very, very sentimental. Probably a weakness, actually. Perhaps I should have identified that as a weakness. If I'd been less sentimental, I might have climbed further up the pole.
Let's have another record.
Well, I think next I would like to play Paul Robeson singing Lord God of Abraham from the film Proud Valley. Paul Robeson was one of the great American socialists. The American government took away his passport. He wasn't allowed to leave the country. It was during the period of the Cold War and McCarthyism. And my father and I were on a committee to get his passport back. And when he got it back, he came to tea at the House of Commons. And I met him then, and he walked in. It was like an electromagnet going through a pile of iron filings. People just detached themselves from the crowd to be near him. And I recall that. But this particular thing is from a film, Proud Valley, where he was a black Pennsylvania miner in South Wales, and he made great friends with the Welsh miners, of which I'm an honorary member, I'm proud to say. And this is from the film of Paul Robeson singing this solo in the Welsh Choral Society meeting. It's lovely.
Lord God of Abraham, hear, oh hear me, Lord, and answer me. Lord God of Abraham, Isaac and Israel, oh hear me,
Paul Robeson singing Lord God of Abraham from the film Proud Valley. Let's talk about your political career, Mr. Benn. You were elected in 1950 for Bristol South East, Stafford Cripp's old seat.
That's right. He'd sat there from 1930 to 50, and then he was dying of cancer, and I got in at the age of 25. I was very, very lucky. And I was there for 33 years until they abolished my constituency in the 1983 redistribution. So that was a very big influence, the Bristol constituency.
Now, by 1964, you were in the Wilson government, 14 years after entering the House. In fact, you were in all of his governments and Callaghan's, weren't you?
Yes, I was.
Which was the most exciting time for you of those years?
Well, it was all very interesting. I really did two jobs throughout the period under various names. I was Postmaster General, which at the time was responsible for BBC and broadcasting policy, the job they transferred to the Home Office. And then later I was Minister of Posts and Telecommunications in the second government, which was the same job. And then I was Minister of Technology, Minister of Industry, Secretary for Energy. So I was always in the industrial area. And I did find that extremely interesting. I mean, one of the reasons why my views were radicalised was that I did spend 11 years trying to implement a policy that, quite candidly, was the SDP policy.
What you're saying is that you were forced by Wilson to put into effect SDP policies?
Well, no. I mean, I'm not blaming him, no. I went in thinking that we could, by a bit of adjustment, solve the problems. We couldn't. And we ended up with the most horrific centralised pay policy in the winter of discontent, and the whole thing really became unwieldy and unacceptable and unjust, so that I was radicalised by my experience at the top, whereas many people begin as radicals and then are sort of become made moderates, or whatever you'd call it, by the experience of office. The opposite happened to me.
It is difficult to understand, and I think it was difficult for your colleagues at the time to understand during the years of 68 to 72, for example, how in the early part of that period you were the eager technocrat that you describe. You were in favour of membership of the common market. You were welcoming Barbara Castle's reform of the trade unions in place of strife. And then by 1972, by the second half of that period, suddenly you're against all of those things. You're considering resigning your Privy Councillorship. You are, I think you wrote in your diary at the time, you wanted to strip yourself of what the world had to offer.
And I think what happened during those years was that in the working week I was trying to be a practical minister, but in weekend speeches I was thinking much more deeply about these things, and it didn't happen suddenly. You see, you mustn't think it was just a question of opportunism, which is what is sometimes thought. I think that in the course of life, people do change their view. And what you have to do is to examine very carefully whether it was a genuine and authentic and serious decision to reach based on experience, or whether it was just hopping all over the place. I think there is a continuity of thought in favour of more democracy, more internationalism, a higher degree of sort of moral judgment in politics, and that these are the guiding lights which you could trace back right back to my childhood. I think if I had to defend myself before the throne of the heavenly grace, I think that's what I would say on the day of judgment.
Shall we pause for a record there?
Yes, now Joan Baez is singing Joe Hill. Joe Hill was a Swedish trade unionist, went to the United States and was executed on a trumped-up charge. And Joan Baez, one of my favourite folk singers, sings this song, which Paul Robeson has also recorded, and was one of the most famous songs of the international labour movement. And it contains within it ideas of the immortality of ideas, which I think are immensely inspiring.
I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I never died, said he. I never died, said he.
Joan Baez singing Joe Hill. You said, Mr. Benn, there that your change of political heart was not opportunism. Your critics, of course, have said that it was, that what you were seeking to do was to appeal over the heads of the parliamentary party to the people beyond, your power base as you saw it.
I think it is true that the government, which includes all parties and both houses, both sides of the House of Commons, have got a certain sort of vested interest in keeping things as they are, and yet we live in a society, and particularly in a world of bitter injustice, and that challenge has to come. So it isn't a power base exactly, it's that you try to represent the people who are suffering injustice and clamour at the door for justice with them. And of course, if you say opportunism, I mean, if the opportunism was thought to escalate you to the top of the Labour Party, then it would be very successful. Indeed, most people would argue that it was because I pursued this particular view of politics that I didn't go further on the ladder, whatever that may mean. So in that sense, it was done from commitment and not from any particular desire to advance myself, because it certainly hasn't had that effect.
No, but you were not to know that at the time. Perhaps there was a moment in the early 70s when you felt that you could, in that moment, take control of the party.
No, I've never believed that. I've never believed that. And indeed, the people who have sacrificed their view in order to get to the top have very often really left no footprints in the sands of time. I really think I have chosen quite consciously to go to give people confidence in themselves and not confidence in me.
But you've gone on challenging the leadership.
Ah, yes, but that's a different thing, because you see, elections are a platform, aren't they? And I think people see elections much too much in terms of the outcome.
So that when you stood against Dennis Healey for the deputy leadership in 81 and against Neil Kinnock last autumn for the leadership itself, you were not necessarily seeking to replace them, but simply for your challenge to be heard. Is that right?
Well, obviously if you stand, you're standing seriously. It's not what one might call a frivolous candidature. But in the case of those two candidatures, they did have, because of the number of meetings and opportunities to make speeches and so on, they had an impact on the opinion, not only of the Labour Party, but I think of the public as a whole.
But your critics would say that your impact is to destroy the Labour Party's chances of getting into power because you constantly rock the boat.
But isn't it funny that they never say that about the people who leave the Labour Party and swing to the right? Have you ever heard Roy Jenkins described as the man who destroyed the Labour Party? Have you ever heard David Owen described as the man who destroyed the Labour Party? Have you ever heard Shirley Williams described? It's only when you speak for a certain point of view that that argument is used. And the truth is that people who come up with ideas that are unacceptable to the leadership are always denounced. And I think very often maybe the boat rockers turn out to be the people who are building the craft that will carry the crew into the harbour of victory a few years ahead.
I think we'll leave politics there and ask you for your sixth record.
Well, Mahalia Jackson singing We Shall Overcome. It is the great song of the popular movements all over the world, but it is also very, very much the women's song, and that's why I chose Mahalia Jackson to sing it.
We shall overcome.
Yeah, Lord, Lord, Lord.
We shall overcome.
One sweet day, we shall overcome. One day, we shall overcome. One day, we shall overcome.
Mahalia Jackson singing We Shall Overcome. You've mentioned, Mr. Benn, the many myths that surround you. You are, it seems, the sort of man about whom stories abound. For example, they say that you're constantly wired for sound.
That's one of the myths, that I've got a tape recorder in my breast pocket, and anyone who says anything. I am recording this, I might add, and I shall record the programme when it's broadcast, and if I ever had the time, would be able to study with microscopic care.
What had been cut out. Is it true that every morning when you lie in bed you project a photo slide of your day's engagements onto the ceiling
I've
above
never
you?
heard that one. So no, I don't, you must have worked
good
that
one,
one up
though.
for yourself. No, I've never heard that one. It's a good idea, actually. It's well, I'm not sure. It'd be quite complicated to set it up. Well, it's nice to be able to kill something I've never actually heard before. That really is
Now,
nice.
do you drink a mug of workman's tea made straight into the mug, on the tea bag, on the hour, every hour?
Well, unless I have to do it more often. I mean, I can sometimes go for an hour, and indeed in this interview I've had 2 tiny cups of coffee. I did once work out that the amount of tea I drank would have been sufficient to displace the QE2 when I had an idle moment and a calculator. and I'm very fond of tea, but then you see I'm a teetotaler and a vegetarian and so on, and all the concentration is on the tea. Isn't that odd? I mean, it must be because they don't want people to hear what you're saying. So if you can make Mr. Benn out slightly mad, he projects his engagements on the ceiling, he has mugs of tea, then you're not really listening to what he's saying.
But from everything you say, it must be terribly difficult for you to go on, to get up every day and go out there and face all these people who are meant to believe that you're some kind of crank.
No, but they don't believe it. I mean, one of the great illusions is that people take the slightest bit of notice of what Newsnight or the Daily Mail or the Sun say. I promise you, if you followed me round and just got the sense of warmth, I mean, how on earth do you think I've survived? If people really did wave their fist at you, but they don't. Now, I'm not saying that they support my views. That would be a great error. But I think at the moment I feel as if I live in Rhodesia under Ian Smith, where he thought that everybody agreed with him except for that old troublemaker, Robert Mugabe. And then when there was an opportunity, it all went differently. So it's a very different world I live in. And truthfully, I wouldn't be so cheerful if I really was having to avert my eyes when I went along the street because there were so many people with rolled up copies of the Daily Telegraph waiting to bash me on the head. It isn't like that at all.
But it's obviously a very hopeful world you live in. If you mention the name of Robert Mugabe, who eventually came to power, you mention building the craft that will sail into the future. So you have an eye still to the future and to your own success.
Oh, well, not so much my own, because one of the nice things about getting older is you don't want anything. I mean, obviously I don't want a peerage, I don't want cash, and I don't want office, personally, for myself. And, of course, if you don't want anything, you're very, very much stronger. And I'm enormously optimistic about the future. But, of course, there are a few little things we've got to clear up, and there are a few little problems. I think one of the problems, if you're a socialist, is this, that people at the moment, after this terrible experience of the last 10 years, where an awful lot of people have suffered, you know, the roller coaster of Thatcherism, they want a convalescence. They want security. And at the same time, in order to give it, you've got to make a lot of changes. And therefore, when I look ahead, because we've talked a lot about the past, I think, how can you reassure people that the old values of decency and treating each other as brothers and sisters in peace, how can they be reintroduced and moral values brought into society without giving people another 10 years of a roller coaster?
Your 7th record.
Well, where are we? I think the world turned upside down. It's a rather good one after all I've said about security and convalescence. But you see, we've got a tremendously strong radical tradition right back to the Peasants' Revolt and the Levellers, and this is sung by Roy Bailey. I first heard him in Burford Church in 1976 when I gave a lecture on the Levellers. And Roy Bailey sang this song, The World Turned Upside Down, and it is about a little group known as the Diggers, who were the first socialists who went to St George's Hill in Weybridge in Surrey and set up their little settlement. And from that day to this, these people, who never held any office at all and were destroyed by the soldiers went in and chased them off their land, these people are still an inspiration 300 years later.
We come in peace, they said, to dig and sow. We come to work the lands in common and to make the waste grounds grow. This earth divided we will make whole, so it will be a common treasury for all.
The World Turned Upside Down, sung by Roy Bailey. We've said, I think, several times, Mr. Benn, or you have, that you're 63 years old. Would it be a frightfully sexist thing to say you don't look it?
Well, I don't. It would be an ageist thing to say, because I suppose when you get to this age, people talk about the veteran, the old man, as a form of abuse, which is the equivalent, I suppose, of sexism. But I allow it. I wouldn't take a day off my life. I wouldn't go back to yesterday. And if I'd known what fun it was to be 60, I'd have done it years ago. Somebody said if I'd known what fun grandchildren was, I would have had them first. And I've got now 5 grandchildren, a little granddaughter. All my children are very, very happy and very supportive, and so I've never been happier in my life.
I have read you are a model husband, a model father, and a model grandfather.
Well, I don't know about that.
They do write nice things about you.
I'm a happy father and a happy grandfather. And it's very nice. People who have the advantage of a family do gain a lot. And you see in your children, of course, development. All my children are active politically and doing work that they enjoy. So I couldn't ask for more, really. I hope I live to a great old age. My father lived to 83. My mother is 92, so I suppose I should run to the mid-80s. And as somebody once said at my age, I still haven't decided what I'm going to do when I grow up.
Let's have your last record.
Well, the last record is a piece of music, a madrigal, written by my son Stephen, who's very talented. He wrote it when he was 19, and he's written a great deal since, and never ever been broadcast before. But when my daughter-in-law, Rosalind Hillary, my second son's wife, died very tragically of cancer 10 years ago, he played it at the funeral, and he played it at his own wedding in the crypt of the House of Commons only last October. He was the bridegroom, and also he went and sat down at the organ and played this lovely madrigal. And when I die, I hope and believe that will be played on the organ in the little church in St. Lawrence where my ashes will rest. So I can think of nothing that I would want to listen to more than the madrigal by Stephen Benn.
Madrigal, composed and played by Stephen Benn. Is that then, Mr. Benn, the record you would choose as your favourite of the 8?
Oh, yes. I've heard it many times in the church, and I've heard it... and it's very, very restful. My mother's favourite piece of music, too. And of all the pieces I've chosen, I would like that to be able to listen to that. And if I was not rescued before my time came, that's the record I'd put on as I took my last gasp, after I'd had my last cup of tea.
Oh, I see. Is that your luxury?
Well, I was going to say, if you allow a kettle and an inexhaustible supply of tea bags, I think that's what I'd go for.
And a mug?
Well, a mug. I suppose I might be able to drink out of a coconut if there wasn't one. I didn't know I was allowed a mug as well. But
yes, I think you could. You haven't told us about your book.
Well, the 2 books that have most influenced me in my life, I have not read. The Bible, who's read the whole Bible? And Das Kapital, who's read the whole of Das Kapital. But those 2 books, the moral teaching and the political analysis, are the great influences, whether we know it or not, in our century. And I suppose the complete works of Shakespeare, I think you'll give me, which I would read, bedside reading. But to read the Bible from cover to cover and to read Das Kapital from cover to cover, I think would give me a better understanding of the world from which I had been removed in my isolation on the desert island than anything else.
Tony Benn, thank you very much indeed for letting us hear your Desert Island Discs.